I think it's almost 4:15, so we can start. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the discussion inspired by Sonia Amade's new book, Prisoner's Reason. My name is Magdalena Nowacka, and together with Marian Goodman, I will share and moderate today's event. Marian and I are researchers at TINT, Academy of Finland Center of Excellence in the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. TINT is an organizer and host of today's event, and since I mentioned that, let me thank very warmly Uska Limaki, the director of the center, for his enthusiasm and support for having this event here, for the idea of having this event and this discussion here. So what we are going to talk about this afternoon. In 2016, the term post-truth was declared the word of the year by Oxford Dictionary, as the use of the term increased by 2,000 times compared to the previous year. There are those who argue that the recent discussion on post-truth is almost hysterical reaction of the liberal elites to the loss of their privileged position in the public sphere. At the same time, there are those, it is very often claimed, that the so-called post-truth era is in fact nothing really new, as the deception and lying as political practice that is present in democracy since its very beginning. On the other hand, there are those who see something very special, new and distinct in the erosion of norms that used to control the way we make epistemic claims in the public sphere, and those who really want to understand in which way and to what extent the new technologies contribute to this erosion. I think it should be also mentioned that very often in the discussion on post-truth, philosophy is being blamed for it, especially epistemic relativism, the idea that truth can vary depending on the context, like roughly speaking. And for Sonia Amadae, whose work inspires our discussion today, post-truth is a problem, and she sees the origins of it in neoliberalism and in the game theory that was involved in the practices of neoliberal institutions. And our discussants will engage with this claim by Sonia, and then they will present their own diagnosis, analysis, and possible remedy for the post-truth momentum we are in. So this is an excellent moment to
It's a tall order.
Let me now introduce our distinguished speakers then. Sonia Amadae is a research fellow at TINT, as a research affiliate at MIT. She works on the foundations of liberalism, political philosophy, and philosophy of social science. Sonia has had appointments at Cambridge, LSE, Harvard, among other places. Her first book, Rationalizing Capitalist Democracy, won the prize of the American Political Science Associations, and from January, Sonia will be Professor of International Political Economy at Swansea University in Wales. Koivunen is Professor of Cinema Studies in the Department of Media Studies at Stockholm University. She's also affiliated with the University of Helsinki. She has written on the history of Finnish cinema and television, feminist film theory, and affective turn in social science, among other things. And is also an active columnist and blogger. Risto Penttilä is a policy expert and former member of the Finnish Parliament. He is chief executive and president of the Finnish Chamber of Commerce. Risto holds PhD in international relations from Oxford University College. He has published several books on international relations, business, and economics, and he actively comments on these topics in international and national media. Teivainen As professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki, he publishes about a wide range of topics. Most recently, he works on transnational social movements, contradictions of global capitalism, and theories of democracy. He has just published in Finnish a book on nationalism, patriotism, and in context of world politics. And apart from being an academic, Teivo is also a social activist. And Thomas Wallgren is a philosopher, activist, and politician. He works as a senior lecturer at the University of Helsinki and is the director of the von Wright and Wittgenstein archives. He studied philosophical discourse of modernity and Enlightenment, the very notion and role of philosophical thinking, and philosophy of Wittgenstein and von Wright. Thomas is elected to the Helsinki city council. So, welcome. Welcome. We are really, really delighted to have you all with us tonight, almost. And now Marion will tell a few words about the way in which we will proceed with the discussion. Thank you so much.
So, yes, this definitely works. Välkomna, tervetuloa, welcome from me as well. So I'm in charge of moderating this discussion and keeping order. So I'd just like you to have a quick idea of what will happen. So now Sonia will start giving a presentation on her book and summarize some of her main thoughts. And then we'll have a presentation from all the other speakers. This will be followed by a short panelist discussion here, and at which point we want you to think about questions to ask the panel. Now, the method of asking a question is not the ordinary one, raising your hands. It's a slightly more orderly fashion. So we want you to write down your questions. So that's why there are little pads and pens at your seats. If you have a question for a particular panelist, that's fine too, but just try to indicate that. So at the end of the panelist discussion, which will be around 5:30, then we'll have just a very short break so that you can leave your questions over here, and then we'll resume with some questions and answers. But do stick around to 6 o'clock, because then there's also a wine reception. So, at that point, I think I want to hand over the word to Sonia for some discussion.
So, thank you very much for Marion and Magdalena for your amazing introductory statements for our event, the fake news event. Okay, speak up. All right. And so, thank you, Marion. Okay, good. All right. Thank you for pointing out that you couldn't hear. All right, so I'm putting forward in my book, Prisoners of Reason, a very clear thesis that people can accept or not. And it's about neoliberal political economy and neoliberal economics. And I'm arguing just a very clear statement that neoliberal economics, neoliberal political economy is that which emerges from the institutions that are informed by game theory. That is by the theory of strategic rational action. And strategic rational action that is in game theory, sometimes we come by it by the name of rational choice theory, and it's also incorporates expected utility theory. I'm not going to give a tutorial on game theory. However, here is just a synopsis, and when I say game theory, I'm talking about orthodox game theory, not necessarily some of the heterodox forms that are more open-minded about the different kinds of action that one could consider rational. So who is the rational actor? And this is just a synoptical overview of some of the features, some of the characteristics of who the strategic rational actor is. The strategic rational actor is theorized to be always individually competitive against all other agents. So that even if sometimes there are coalitions of individuals, after a while the coalition will break down and individuals will compete with another. For example, in a marriage, that maybe people get along for so long, but at the end of the day, they'll compete strategically with one another. In orthodox game theory, actors only care about outcomes, and these outcomes are typically financial. They're monetary. That means that only incentives move actors, and usually that is financial incentives. In the framework of this theory, actors cannot make commitments and they cannot keep promises because that would be irrational. And actors cannot cooperate voluntarily in a group or as a team, according to the orthodox theory of strategic rational action. This was put forward by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in 1944 in their game theory. So in terms of neoliberalism, one of my strategies has been to try to understand what theorists who use neoliberalism in a positive way, theorists who contribute to neoliberalism, what they mean by the inside of theory rather than from a critical external perspective. So here is a book with, you can see neoliberalism in the title. This is a book in international relations. And these theorists come up with a school of neoliberalism, and they mean a very particular school of thought. What they mean is an attempt to understand international relations among actors only assuming strategic rational action as the theory of rationality. In so doing, they attempt to think they can capture what we would have meant by classic liberalism, and the jury is out on whether they can do that. I argue they cannot. But they are very emphatic that the only rational form of action is strategic, that's consistent with game theory. Here's another way to define neoliberalism. And here I'm using the Washington Consensus, which was the School of Economics that was in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in the 1990s. Here's the author, John Williamson. He coined the term neoliberalism, and he used the word neoliberalism to refer to the Washington Consensus, which was the phrase that he coined. And it had a very specific platform of policies that came from public choice theory, which he also mentions in his documents. These involve fiscal discipline of a state budget. That any investment should be pro-growth, so you don't invest in any social program that wouldn't create a profit. That the society should have market interest rates and market exchange rates. That all trade should be liberalized. State enterprises should be privatized. There should be deregulation, and property rights should be secure. So this is the neoliberal platform that Williamson enunciates under the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. Okay, so if you follow, I'm going quickly through my book. If you follow rational choice theory, and if you are a student and you're in an economics or political science department or a business school or a policy program, then you learn certain outcomes of the theory. You learn that it is irrational to vote unless you're a pivotal voter. You learn that democracy will give us irrational outcomes. You learn that there is no public interest, there's no public good, and you can't even really have a meaningful notion of a public. You learn that voluntary cooperation is irrational, free riding is rational, and only incentives motivate. That's the canonical pedagogy of rational choice and game theory. Okay, so the way that we had thought about our event was to think about how neoliberalism ends up in a post-truth politics, and also how it could be potentially linked to violence. And before moving on to the theme of the post-truth politics, I want to bring up how this theory of strategic rationality can have an inherent kind of violence. And I have 5 different kinds of violence that come up in this strategic form of rationality. Strategic rationality has the idea that we always treat others as means to our ends because we're strategic and all other people are there in terms of how we can relate to them to seek our own ends. There's an idea of coercive bargaining, which is categorically different from normative bargaining. In coercive bargaining, you threaten the worst on the opponent if they fail to reach an agreement with you, instead of a normative bargain where you come to a consensus about what the best means of exchange is. Structural violence is the kind of violence that comes out from institutions, and the kinds of structural violence that come out of neoliberal institutions are that we accept that it's okay to harm people as long as it's just a matter of statistics. So if we know that there's going to be a certain number of statistical deaths in a population from a pollution, then if we change the statistical morbidity, what the outcome would be of whether it's 1 in a million or 1 in 2 million that would be harmed, that's a statistical type harm, and it's hard to think of that as harm. And so there's a structural violence in terms of accepting how people could just be a statistical casualty of some action. There's also the sense that individuals must be responsible for their own economic well-being. So there's a notion, it's called, in terms of critical neoliberal studies, self-responsibilization. So every individual is responsible for whether they make it or not. There's not a sense of independence or dependence of individuals. So there's a perpetuation of precarity, meaning that individuals at no time feel safe. And this seems to be no matter where people are in the hierarchy of neoliberalism. Okay, so now that probably sounded really extreme. But in my research, what I've tried to do is back up every single one of my claims with theorists who I characterize as neoliberal according to my definition. So here I'm just reading from their own words. James M. Buchanan, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said in 1975, each person seeks mastery over a world of slaves, and that's the basis of his political thinking, that's what we all seek to do. And then we need to build institutions that accommodate us, assuming that is our fundamental nature. Lawrence Summers, who is the chief economist at the World Bank and also Obama's chief economic advisor, I think that the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. And his reasoning is that people in lower wage countries, they're worth less in terms of the fact that over their lifetimes, their income stream has a lesser total value than people in developed countries, so that economically, we're not harming the total value created by harming the morbidity, the statistical likelihood of people being sick in these countries. And Summers finds that logic is intrinsic to this neoliberal paradigm and admits it up front. Here's another quote. Now, this is from John Williamson of Washington Consensus, and this quote relates to, I guess, what Naomi Klein has called shock therapy in Latin America. Now, what I found this quote when I was researching here at the University of Helsinki, and this was the first time that I found a quote that really substantiated this idea. John Williamson writes, if it indeed proves difficult to identify cases of the sort of extensive policy reform needed to make the transition to an open, competitive market economy that were not a response to a fundamental crisis, then we will have to ask ourselves whether it would conceivably make sense to think of deliberately provoking a crisis so as to remove the political logjam to these neoliberal economic reforms. And that's a very powerful statement, and it basically, it's in the company of the technocrats that were involved in the Pinochet administration. And if you read closely through the neoliberal texts, then you realize that this coercive bargaining, which is to threaten the worst on individuals if they fail to cooperate, that if you create a crisis, then you've created a new status quo, and then people will be more likely to settle for less in the social contract. And this is a validation of that theory from somebody who's inside that paradigm and actually implementing it in countries in Latin America in the late 1980s and the 1990s. Okay, now I just throw in here, just to be provocative, because a lot of my work has been on the nuclear security dilemma, that another inherent form of violence in neoliberalism is the fact that this strategic rationality of game theory is our theory of nuclear deterrence. And so the fact that we now live at the a countdown to midnight, it's 2.5 minutes to midnight, which is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has never said a countdown to midnight is less than about 3 minutes since throughout the Cold War. So the fact that we still have these nuclear weapons, they're still informed by strategic rationality. And my colleague, who's a nuclear security specialist, has called this the nuclear eternity. There's this idea that we're just going to live with these weapons on hair trigger alert indefinitely. And I just hope that somehow we don't end up in a kind of nuclear exchange that would essentially annihilate all life. So that's another example of an inherent kind of violence that's incorporated into nuclear deterrence theory and is very routine. Okay, so then this is really coming to the end of what I argued in the book, but looking at the present moment, what are the seeds of illiberalism? Well, some of the seeds are this gross disparity of income, and this is just looking at some figures in the United States, looking at top income earners who are moving rapidly away from the lower income earners. So how does this maybe breed neoliberalism? So early illiberalism was in Hungary, it was in Turkey, and it was argued by Fareed Zakaria. The countries that did not establish a secure constitutional democracy would be prone to liberalism because they did go through the correct historical trajectory. But now we know that countries such as the United States and Britain are also prone to this post-truth political moment. And I mean, I think it's pretty astounding in terms of a breakdown of being able to pose epistemic claims about states of the world, that the White House would actually utter a statement to say there were more people on the White House lawn during the Trump administration's inauguration than for the Obama administration. That's just flat shocking, and there should be a global outcry to this. So how is this connected to game theory? Well, it turns out that there's a theory of communication that is also firmly contoured by strategic rationality, under the idea that all of communication is just a signal, and that we simply signal that which we think will have the best result on the audience in terms of getting the outcome that we want. This is called communication as cheap talk. And it's, if you Google cheap talk and game theory, you'll see the extensive number of papers on this theme. So the idea is that you always calculate whether you lie or whether you tell the truth. And so I argue that if we accept this premise that the strategic rational actor in its orthodox form is the only way to be rational in human society, that will end up with a neoliberal society where everyone is trying to get to the top, and in doing so, there's a systemic violence quality of stepping up on other individuals. And so I wanted to end on a note of resistance. And so my ideas for resistance have to do with that we can work together as individuals, we can have solidarity, we can have compassion, that the idea of intelligibility, just understanding what it means to act in an action context, recognizing one another as individuals with human dignity, trusting oneself that we wouldn't violate promise and commitments, having commitments, and then going through the level, holding accountable the people at the top of this pyramid, and making sure that we have a robust public sphere with kinds of checks and balances that would be able to vet claims in terms of truth and falsehood. So those are my remarks. Thank you.
So thanks. Post-truth is a symptom of a disease which is deep and long in our Western culture. So post-truth is just what we're coming: evolution psychology, game theory, mad mutual assured destruction as a nuclear doctrine, and neoliberal economics are all symptoms of the same disease. So that's where I agree with Sonia very much, and I highly recommend her book. The idea that is that we can criticize and form winning political reactions to neoliberalism by criticizing the economic system is a shallow and false idea. We are dealing with a thing which my friends in India call satanic globalization, and the reason why we can't change things in our direction is that our critique is too shallow. So that's where Sonia's book helps a lot. It also helps in seeing that the madness of authoritarian capitalism has two phases. One is economic and the other military. So these are the two forms of power that they use against us. In order to understand the roots of these forms of power, we have to understand the dialectics of Enlightenment, namely how Western culture has partly and profoundly been shaped by its image, its self-understanding of itself as a rational culture. What is the conception of rationality that has shaped this civilization since Parmenides? And this is what I will go through very quickly. So indicate first a few points of agreement with Sonia, then some disagreement, and then some solutions to the problems that Sonia is unable to solve. So this is what I learned. The book is very lucid, very clear, and I think also very precise and deep in criticism of game theory. I also highly recommend the broad spectrum of application. I think, for instance, the idea of bringing in the common roots of evolution psychology and nuclear doctrines is quite rare. So I congratulate that. So then some critique. Sonia Amadae comes from a liberal tradition, and I think in her conception of freedom and in her conception of society, she's far too close to the target she criticizes. I think we can't understand how neoliberalism has proliferated unless we understand how it is actually how it is a legitimate development of classical liberalism more than I think comes out from Sonja's book. And that is what I will sort of be, that is the topic I will try to address. Then a minor thing is, I think, the record of the historical simultaneous occurrence of this phenomenon don't really mean that they explain each other. I think game theory, Wallgren's article from 1943, that's very much highlighted in the book, is again just one symptom of a deep disease that goes back through the millennia. So this is, but here the diagnosis PD is my issue in R. This is Prisoners of Reason, page 18, where we have this idea of a shift in recent decades from classical liberalism to neoliberalism, also got a shift from modernism to postmodernism in the book. And I think the diagnosis is correct. We have experienced a shift in understanding the agents who inhabit civil society, from individuals who voluntarily respect others' human dignity, that's classical liberalism, to those who pursue self-interest without regard for their impact on others. So this shift in how agents understand themselves is the shift from the classical liberal commonwealth idea to the neoliberal regime. And I think it's also very correct when Sonja writes on page 18 that at the heart of neoliberal doctrine is the idea that we can find a basis for our understanding of economic life and economic activity by using a game theory which we see as standing outside of moral reasoning. Now this I think is true, and I want to share some ideas with you of how I would like to enrich Sonja's analysis of what this idea is of standing outside moral reasoning. Why is the idea attractive? What are the limits of the idea? And where is reason really located? So those are my topics. And I first want to, my first comments on the limit idea of personhood in theory. I think we don't really, we'll be unable to address the problems in the neoliberal idea of personhood unless if we only accept, or if we accept classical liberalism. I think in classical liberalism, especially when you go down to Hume, Locke, and Hobbes, the founding fathers, we find ideas which have been later much enriched in the Hegelian tradition, already in Kant's political philosophy, but especially then in Hegel and after, where we have the idea that we don't have a society not formed of individuals who originally stand isolated and then come together to form society. So there's an ontological mistake at the heart of the liberal tradition. That society are not composed of atomistic individuals who then sort of decide to come together. So there's the recognition of what was mentioned on the last slide by Sonja. There's such things as love, friendship, solidarity, and these things are constitutive of who we are. So the idea that we are born as isolated individuals is a false idea. Then let me go to the second comment, which is on rationality. What is human reason? Well, human reason, at the heart of human reason is the endeavor to try to understand our concepts. How can we understand concepts? Well, concepts are not something that I own and I give to you. Concepts are something we share. In order for me to understand what my concepts mean, what it means to be yourself, what it means to have friendship, I have to talk with you. Because you are a bearer of the meaning of this concept equal to me. So this is the Socratic idea of rationality, that we only find human reason in the engagement with the other. And in this engagement, we can only find reason, truth, and good life if we are sincere, if we speak truth. So this is the truthful politics, the real politics, as Socrates calls it, I think, in the Lysis. So this is the second, so the false idea of rationality. The third, what is my interest? There's an idea that that my interest would have to do with the flourishing myself. But we know from Gandhi that there's an alternative. I have a good life only if everybody I care for, everything I care for has a good life. So that's the end of self-interest. That's one perspective. The other fundamental critique of self-interest comes from Wittgenstein, and you all know it. There's one thing I know, there's, by the way, one of the few quotes from Wittgenstein that we have in English. Wittgenstein was his friend in the 1930s or early 40s. He lives in Britain at the time, already a British citizen, and so he's well exposed to the liberal tradition. And he says, there's one thing I know, we are not here to have a good time. So that's another end of neoliberal politics. So let me go to why, I mean, how can this crazy game theoretical notion of reason and society proliferate? How can such a thing gain ground at all? It is because we have deep in our culture and deep in ourselves a conception of rationality where we stand isolated from each other. It goes back to Parmenides and his idea of logic, where there's a logical proof in Parmenides that change is not possible. Change is logically impossible. This is a logical truth, one of the early logical proofs we have in our tradition. And why is this idea of, and then Parmenides thinks that logic stands at the heart of reason, and at the heart of reason we find proof of the idea that there is no such thing as time. And that is one of the original ideas of how reason is liberated. Because reason, when we realize that it's logical truth that no such thing as time, then we are liberated from suffering, which is one of the original ideas in philosophies. There's no time, so there's no life. So we are free. We find freedom in the absolute now, which is death. So that's the philosophy of death, which is at the core of the Western tradition of rationality. So how then can we use Wittgenstein? This is my deep agreement with Sonia, that she's one of the few colleagues who has realized that in Wittgenstein's philosophy of logic, we find not only the ammunition to prove, to criticize neoliberalism, but also find the elements we need to construct another vision of rationality that will free us to a life in friendship and solidarity. So, first let me say that Wittgenstein in his great book Tractatus, he perfects the dream of Parmenides and says this is post-truth. The fundamental book, fundamental Bible of post-truth politics is Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, where we find remark 6.4. I read it to you in English, I have it here in the original German. All propositions that are of equal value. So whether I lie or the truth, doesn't matter, it's all of equal value. Whatever I say is always of equal value. So this is the Bible of neoliberalism. And then of course, Wittgenstein learns as he grows older that there's no such thing. This idea, this book is based on the idea there is such a thing as logical form. Where we find logical form? Well, in order to understand what has logical form, we have to go to the language. Where we find in language? Well, if I want to understand whether a sentence I speak has a logical form, I have to find out whether it has place in my communication with others. So I have to enter a moral relationship with others. I have to be part of a society as a equal to my sisters and brothers before I can understand whether there is such a thing as a sentence. So this is the solution to the Parmenidean problem of logic and how logic is part of life and part of death. And when we see that, we'll see, skip this, also through feminist critique of the philosophy of mind, we are at the same conclusion, this is the ontological point, that there is no such thing as a mind, that we can have a theory of, and therefore again, no such thing as an isolated individual who has rationality, which we can understand independently of social life, and then enter social life with that understanding. So we have these philosophical problems and solutions. I invite you to study with me philosophy and its problems, and then we will understand not only how game theory is wrong, but we will also understand what is there in us, the craving for death, the liberation from life and the suffering of life, the suffering of these miserable people here who don't understand me and they understand me wrongly or they treat me badly. All these terrible things that happen when I relate to other people, all those things can be overcome. I am attracted by that idea. Time and social relations, love, and all that can fail me. So please give me game theory and I'll be liberated from all this. So, ich bin ein Game Theorist.
Thank you. So great to be here and to be able to say a few words inspired by this wonderful, wonderful book by Sonia. And also with the problem of having to speak after Thomas, because always when Thomas speaks and I come after him, I just tear his stuff apart and you know, and then we end up in this horrible debate. So I try to keep myself from doing that. I've done that many, many times. So I think this book is really important for understanding some of the normative foundations of our time, and I simply focus on one dimension there that I took home from the book. There are many other dimensions there, which is the distinction between what Sonia calls classical liberalism and neoliberalism. And the most wonderful thing about this, that she pays attention to something I found very, very important, which is the harm principle. And one of the key distinctive features, according to Sonia's argument, of neoliberal thought as distinct from classical liberalism is that the harm principle, or no harm principle, as you call it, plays almost no role in neoliberalism. When I was here in this wonderful Tiedekulma, TINT corner last time on Friday, and I took a tram back home after a nice event, I was able to witness how this is true. I met my dear friend, our dear friend. I just asked Anu if she thinks I could mention his name. Juhan Artiainen, a wonderful old friend and economist and member of parliament for the National Coalition Party, so right-wing party, and they had just voted for the new alcohol reform. So Juhan is in the tram. He's like, well, liberalism just took a step forward because they voted for this new, more a new kind of alcohol legislation. And I was like, I don't know, I was in Tiedekulma in this event, and I was just with Professor Juho Saari, who was explaining how many deaths the new legislation will cause from alcohol-related things. And by the way, Johanna, in liberalism, there's harm principle. And so if we assess the alcohol reform from a liberal framework, it's at least not so clear that liberalism has taken a step. And I actually said, if you're true liberal, there are many other drug-related reforms that if you look at Portugal, for example, and decriminalization of other kinds of drugs than alcohol, there's almost a wide scientific consensus that from the harm perspective, it's kind of, there are not so many issues there that it's been causing less harm, the intoxicants there after the reform than before the reform. But here there's almost clear scientific consensus that there will be more harm. So I don't know, for a liberal, if you go for that kind of alcohol reform, let's see how you deal with that other thing. So he actually said, okay, this is a good topic for the next governmental negotiation, which I think he believes they will be in. So let's see how much liberalism advances from here onwards. But it was an example of how the harm principle is often sidestepped by people who consider themselves liberals. And I believe it's very difficult to really define coherently liberal principles of freedom without taking into account the harm principle. And this is a really important contribution by Sonia, because very few people have paid attention to this with such a wonderful clarity. So in some sense, this is an immanent critique, as Thomas, with his stuff on satanic globalization and authoritarian capitalism, was pointing out that maybe your criticism is not deep enough. And I'm not sure, I kind of like immanent critique. Maybe Thomas and the left Hegelians and the Gandhian hippies are right, and we need to, you know, throw away individual ideals of personhood and all that. But I'd like to stay with Sonia for the moment, at least with the immanent critique of liberalism. But let me make an immanent critique of your immanent critique. Because in seeing that the key problem in what you call neoliberalism is the game theoretical understanding of people who pursue their own benefits without taking into account the harm principle. Fine, I think that's very important. I'm not sure to what extent the kind of, if it made sense to explain or understand human behavior on the basis of game theoretical rational choice models. Still, somebody could argue that that could still be combined with the normative framework that takes into account the harm principle. And I think that kind of argument can perhaps be made. I don't believe one can explain human behavior through rational choice models very well, but even if I did, it wouldn't necessarily be incompatible with classical liberal way of understanding the harm principle. So I'm sure the issue with our system, especially if we take Thomas seriously, and there's something about authoritarian capitalism and satanic something and all that there, if something like that is happening. So for me, my kind of immanent critique of what you call neoliberalism is property rights. I tend to believe, or I take as a reasonable hypothesis that I try to explore, that we can have a framework or a coherently liberal framework, something that you in some sense call classical liberalism, and which includes idea of freedom and which includes the idea of personhood and individualism stuff that hippies like Thomas don't like, but let's assume I like it, if only to tease Thomas. But I do. I confess myself to be liberal in this sense. So, individual freedom and the harm principle. You can do whatever you want as long as there's not too much harm to others, and then we define what's too much harm. Right. But then you take inside the bag, when you cite classical liberalism, you almost consistently say that it includes the extension of that personhood in private property, and I understand it to be private property understood in capitalist framework of private property. And I think that's something that should do deal with the question of property in many parts. But just to simplify the argument, I think another way of making an immanent critique of the current way of understanding this liberal something is to say that actually if it's based on a capitalist version of private property, it's a very clearly one of the key defining features of that ideological system. And if we make the argument, and I try to make it sometimes, that actually the kind of capitalist private property can be in contradiction with liberal ideals of freedom, including the harm principle. If some people want to argue that on basis of liberal ideals of freedom, you can sort of defend a model of private property, fine. But I don't think it should be assumed. In history of ideas, it's often assumed because this and that. But in a logical sense, if you look at Construct Mill and all that, I don't think you can claim that private property in the capitalist sense comes with that liberal package. So my kind of immanent critique would be if you say, let's defend classical liberalism against what you call neoliberalism, I would say let's defend liberal and libertarian ideals against what I would call propertarian ideals. And let's take the flags of liberal ideals of personhood and freedom out of the capitalist hands that claim to be liberal, but in practice often let privileges based on property rights to overrule liberal ideals of freedom. So that would be my kind of immanent critique. But your book is really great. It's been really a pleasure to learn from your book. Thank you.
You're welcome to stand or sit. Yes.
It's always a pleasure, yes. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great pleasure to be among philosophers and professors, and I feel very small here, but I'll try and do my best. But before I start, I suppose we should address two questions. Why was I invited? Why did I accept the invitation? I suppose I was invited because I get a feeling that some of these people don't particularly like neoliberalism. So perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps we're looking for somebody who might actually see something rather positive in all of that, to bring a different view. Then I suppose the other bit is, why did I accept the invitation? And I have to say that I thought your thesis was so preposterous. I thought I had to come and listen to you. So this is, I mean, frankly, I read the world from such a different viewpoint. I thought that we have to meet to discuss. So why do I consider your thesis, which thesis that I take away from having read the first chapter or the introduction to your book, not the entire book, is that neoliberalism leads to violence. It might work in theory, I'm not sure, but it certainly doesn't work in practice. Let's look at some of the main philosophies, political philosophies over the past 200 years or so. I can name 5 or 6 that my books can lead, has led to violence. Communism, fascism, nationalism, populism, religious fundamentalism, even, I could argue, neo-mercantilism. But it's a stretch to say that having witnessed these ideologies and their impact on our human race, it is neoliberalism that you pick. So that's why I thought that was interesting. What do I consider as the neoliberal era? Well, I think they started with Thatcher and Reagan, and it ended in my books with 9/11, where the economic paradigm was taken over by the security paradigm. Now, some people would say that it ended later, some people would say that it still continues. But if we look at this neoliberal paradigm, the way I look at it, what did it bring us? I mean, there were awful things, of course, but I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the biggest reduction in global poverty that humankind has ever seen, especially in India and China, emerging markets, the great convergence for the first time in our history. Developing countries started to catch up with rich countries. And yes, 1%, the richest 1% gained awfully lot and too much, I agree. But the biggest gainers in terms of numbers were Chinese middle class, Asian middle class, the middle classes of emerging countries. So and then the end of this liberal era brought us Iraq War, Afghanistan, all of these interventions that we've seen. So I just have a very hard time sort of, you said you can either buy your argument or not, and I have to say I don't. So and in terms of theory, I think that where you probably are right is your criticism of game theory. So I was trying to listen to you. I thought that was good. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I was convinced that your criticism of game theory makes sense. But it's a different thing than criticism of neoliberalism. And then the way you sort of, then when you move from game theory into neoliberalism, you had a collection of anecdotes or quotations, and then I even wrote down some of the things that you attributed to neoliberalism. I just don't recognize this. No public good, no public interest. It is okay to harm people. Always people are means to an end. Nuclear catastrophe that is nearly upon us is caused by neoliberal economic paradigm. I'm at a loss. I just can't follow your logic. But, so the reason I came here, I accepted the invitation, was that I thought that when people have such divergent views, they should meet and discuss. So I'm very happy to continue along these lines, and I accept it. I'm not an expert. I look at this from a practitioner's point of view, but these were my contributions to the debate, and thanks very much indeed for inviting me.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Sonia and others, for the invitation. Can you hear me when I talk like this? No? I need to talk louder.
Closer.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm not used to being criticized for having too little a voice, so that's a first. I wouldn't want to start by speculating about why I was invited for the panel, but since you sort of made confessions about your relationship to the notion of neoliberalism, I feel that I should perhaps start by saying 2 words about that as well. So, quite briefly, I'm with Wendy Brown. So, I very much share her analysis in Undoing the Demos. Her idea about neoliberalism challenging, even destroying, or at least eroding the virtues of liberalism. So that I recognize the tension that she discusses in her book. As a scholar interested in democracy theories, I think that she makes a very strong case. Destroying a sense of demos is, of course, something which is easily sort of adaptable to somebody like me. I'm a media scholar, not a philosopher, not a political scientist, so I come from a line of reasoning where we think in terms of cultural forms and cultural practices and histories and conventions, so it's a different tradition altogether. In any case, this was my confession bit. Other than that, I would make 3 brief remarks on the proposed agenda. Now I usually time myself and now I forgot to. Okay. 3 brief remarks on the proposed agenda. First, on the historical development, the move to neoliberalism described by Sonia in her book. Just very briefly. Secondly, on the notion of the exemplary neoliberal citizen and consumer, a notion which I think is very interesting. And third, and the idea that this exemplary neoliberal citizen and consumer is the strategic rational actor. I won't be going into game theory, that's far too, I'm not familiar at all in that field. I've been learning a lot what I've been reading in Sonia's book, but I will go there. And finally then on post-truth politics and media, just briefly. First, just starting to read Sonia's book and the description of the development whereby the free markets and democratic governance had become unmoored from their classical liberal ideals and refashioned according to the strategic rationality of game theory. The characterizations here, the movement from no harm principle to seeking gain despite others, and concept of mutual benefit having yielded to the inevitability of winners and losers, and norm-bound negotiation having given way to coercive bargaining. So of course I heard Jürgen Habermas in my head, being the media and communication scholar who I am. And so in some sense, this description echoes Habermas' warning of the erosion of bourgeois public sphere. But of course, it also evokes many descriptions of the effects, not to say vicissitudes, of what is being called mediatization of politics. Also, this talk for talk's sake that was flashed in Sonia's slides, in some sense, communication as cheap,
mimification of politics, scoring points, political debate becoming this kind of never-ending pendulum without much meaning. So I think there are interesting parallels here. And of course, research on political communication and journalism has contended empirically many times the proliferation of game frame in how politics is mediated. And I think it would be an interesting question where paradigms meet with cultural historians or media historians thinking about the narrative tropes and media forms that have very long histories, how they have sort of become more visible or how they have gained more prominence in the contemporary media sphere. How much is this this talk for talk's sake a question of zeitgeist? How much is it just now? And I'm just mentioning Lisbeth van Zonen's Entertaining the Citizen when politics and popular culture converge. She's a Dutch media and communication studies scholar. In her book, 2005, she exemplifies cultural theory work on cultural force propelling political imagination. So she, for instance, talks about the trope of quest as mediatizing politics across genres, not just in news, but more generally. So this was my first point. How much would it be? How would it be to sort of take another perspective towards this change of the political public sphere? Secondly, the notion of exemplary neoliberal citizen as rational actor. This is really interesting and intriguing since even though algorithmic logic and the kind of measuring is what media does nowadays, sort of minutely registering our moves and analyzing that data and thinking that media production knows intimately and very precisely and wants to know very precisely what we do with the products that we are using. Nevertheless, discourse in media culture on users is, I would argue, not about rational acting. Rather, it is permeated by ideas about emotional consumer. Of course, also rational consumer, but there is the measuring the consumers. Media audiences are addressed as consumers, not as citizens. Even when we talk about public service media, as we do in Scandinavian countries and many European countries, the discourse of media audiences as citizens has very much vanished altogether. And for instance, in Finland, Yle, the public broadcasting company, invests very heavily in personalized media. So what used to be a proponent of, in some sense, liberal public sphere, for emphasizing reasons, it has never been just that. It has never been the only goal of public service media to establish that kind of landscape, but it used to invest heavily in those kinds of ideas. Now, very much wants to actively fragment, one could argue, the public sphere by addressing individuals. And the latest update of Yle app is a perfect example of that. And that is the development happening all the time. So I think this is an interesting area, how the business, the sphere of business and the area of media culture, which is so disrupted by technology and globalization, and thus very much sort of imbued with economics rhetoric, how in that field this notion of reason seems very difficult to articulate. And I think just to refer to what's happening right now, I've been engaged in a research project called Driving Forces of Democracy, Patterns of Democratization in Finland and Sweden, 1890-2020, and I've been investigating Swedish and Finnish media policies in that project. So it's been my task to sort of think how these two nation states address these disruptive elements of economy, globalization, and changes in political cultures, and how they make attempts to maintain some sense of national public sphere, which is a version of the liberal within nation states, version of those liberal ideals. And it's interesting to note that the Swedish policies, the vocabularies, critical vocabularies mobilized by the government and policies is very much citizen-oriented, explicitly talking about citizens and thinking about civic ideas, sort of mobilizing the liberal, classic liberal language, whereas the Finnish policies and the vocabularies invoked are about consumer choice, just about consumer choice. But interestingly, of course, there is a limit to this consumer choice language, and it emerges right now when we have the security crisis discussion in Finland. What Helsingin Sanomat has done, publishing information that is deemed criminal by the military and security professionals. So there's a very serious questioning at the moment of the scope of journalism and press freedom in Finland. And interestingly, I think there is an inability to mobilize liberal vocabulary of press freedom and source protection as a reaction against it. So there is an interesting case of sort of state violence in some sense, setting an absolute limit, conflicting with liberal ideals, but it's the state that otherwise mobilizes consumer language. Okay, so this was, just briefly then going to my third point, the notion of post-truth politics and media. I'm very skeptical of the term, and I don't use it myself. For me, it's an object of research. In my understanding, its main problem is that it creates a sense of historical break, which is very hard to prove empirically, and it obscures politics as an area where reasoning takes place, but never without effective charges. So I think that in many ways post-truth is, of course, it's about lying, truth and lie, and it's about fiction and fact, but it's also a way to describe political passions, and it's a term with which diverse commentators and analysts try to come to terms with the extent of passions in public discussion, and it's not the first time in history in all ways. And I think that one way to unpack this dramatic notion would be to investigate histories of affective publics. So I'm using here Zizziba Paris's term, affective public, and thinking about affective publics as having histories and unpacking ideas about the rational, unaffective, or unemotional past. So I'm not just proposing to study psychologies or group psychology, but cultures of affect and emotion, and unpacking the idea that, for instance, Cold War, having that as a frame here, I think it would be important to unearth the affective logic of Cold War, not just the rhetoric of fear and threat and competition, explicit there, but also other kinds of affective vocabularies frame politics. We are very intimately familiar with the importance of the notion of friendship as an effective relationship informing Cold War politics. So in relation to post-truth politics, yes, it's important to think about frames of the frame of liberalism and neoliberalism, effects of globalization and economics on media landscape, how that sort of feeds into post-truth politics and media. but I also think that we have to work with the concepts and do our history lessons better, and not to make presumptions on part of politicians or media that there used to be a past without affect.
Okay, so thank you very much all for your presentations. So I think it's suitable to give the word to Sonia to have a brief reply to all these comments. But before I do that, just a reminder of how you ask questions. So jot down your questions on one of the colored papers, and after just Sonia's reply, maybe we have come for some other comment, then we're going to collect the questions. Is this on? Yeah, it's on. Okay.
Thank you to everyone for honoring the book to the extent that I got such amazing feedback. Can everyone hear all right? Okay. So first, just to refer to Tomas's great commentary on the book. I mean, I know that some people find the book that is not radical enough in terms of the imminent critique that starts from liberalism, classical liberalism, and finds fault with neoliberalism in terms of a pathological form, or in terms of not honoring personhood to the extent that we would hope with respect to a no harm principle. And I fully agree. And in fact, I'm sort of reassured that some people find the book too radical, because in most circles, it's like Risto says that the book is much too radical. So maybe I've hit a middle ground, but the dialectic of reason in the West, that's one thing that was very important to me in my book, was to try to show how game theory is part of this development of Western rationality, and there's a lot to come to terms with. And I think we're both scratching the surface probably, and I do agree with you that there's a deeper notion of personhood. So I find your comments very effective, and I appreciate that. And then Teivo was next. So it's interesting because the classic liberal idea of capitalism is personhood, property, and contract. And we got two of them. We got the critique of personhood, and Teivo was saying that leaving aside that maybe the imminent critique is not powerful enough, why can't we just focus on the type of property rights that are specific to the neoliberal project, the neoliberal state? And here, one thing that you didn't mention, Teivo, I'd be curious if we could talk more, whether you're focusing on any private property or specifically the ownership of the means of production, and that the classic response from the left that property rights should permit the means of production to be in common hands. And there is a way in which we know that the neoliberal reforms were adamant about privatizing taking national services and industries from Latin America and privatizing the profit, to the extent that I'm sure you're all aware in Bolivia, the way that water was privatized, even rainwater, that there's this vision of neoliberalism that every single last aspect of the material world should be some form of private property, and that potentially that would go to every pixel, every piece of data eventually. And I do think that this examination, particularly of what are the specific property rights that we find in neoliberalism, I couldn't agree more. I would be all for collaborating on a project to investigate that. So now, Risto, I have often thought one of the reasons I survived as an academic is that I have taken this hard stance on game theory, but I obviously haven't, it hasn't put me over the edge so far that university officials and other people with power have pushed me out entirely. So I think the reason is because I do think that probably many people practicing neoliberalism may not notice how far it has gone from classical liberal ideals. I think I do share with Teivo that there's potential in the classic liberal view of the individual and freedom. Maybe it's not perfect, and maybe it doesn't go far enough, but it's certainly a more secure grounding than the neoliberal. So it'd be interesting if I got to talk to Risto about, say we looked at the Pinochet regime in Chile, would we agree about that, or would we disagree? Was that fine? Is it okay to have some kind of specifically the John Williamson thought that if you can't introduce neoliberal reforms because your population isn't amenable, you needed to have a coup d'etat or hyperinflation. He was very clear about the kinds of crises that you could implement. Where would we stand? Would we agree on these? And I do think that, well, The Economist magazine to me always seemed, in the 1980s, it seemed so far to the right, but now The Economist magazine seems so far on the left. It's pretty astonishing. And I agree with The Economist magazine on many positions. They are critiques of neoliberalism now. So I think if we went case by case, maybe we'd find a common ground in that there is a deviation from the neoliberal principles, from the classic liberal ideas of human freedom and emancipation through individual self-betterment and mutual respect. So I hope we would find more common ground. And I'm so grateful for you for bringing up Habermas and having this grounding in communication, because where my research has taken me since I've arrived here and finished the book is that it does seem as though the neoliberal paradigm of communication, as I would see it, that it does reduce communication to fundamental, strategic, to the signaling and sheep talk. And it does seem, well, my understanding of Habermas, that Habermas thought that there was a way from rationality, the instrumental rationality, and communicative rationality to live side by side. But I think there's a way in which Habermas really underestimated the way in which, where Habermas says that strategy is parasitic on communicative rationality and understanding. I think Habermas might have not estimated the extent to which, when you have strategic rationality, then it claims to be the fundamental point, not that we're building up understanding and cooperation. So I thought that your focus, well, Wendy Brown, and the idea that we're turning into consumers instead of citizens, that's a very important theme. So I think I have more agreement with, I don't know what that means, that I'm having more agreement with the commentators, but I'll pass the microphone on to anybody who would want to add any insights or more.
Yeah. Does anybody have an urgent commentary, or should we? Yeah, I think it's a bit of a dangerous thing if we all start commenting on commenting. So what we'll do then is like 2 minutes pause so that you have time to go to the bathroom, and if you have questions, leave them on the basket. Do you want to indicate the basket?
We'll leave the basket here. So
Okay, so we're leaving it here, so you just come and your questions, and we'll resume in 2 minutes for the discussion. Okay, I think we need to resume here, so we have time for some questions. We're missing the main speaker. Okay, so we have one question here, which I think touches on, so you've all had criticisms of game theory and neoliberalism. At least you all saw that there were some flaws also in game theory. So what do you envision as a democratic or as a counterforce to these problems? Like, Sonia, if you want to start, what is your, do you envision a return to classic liberalism, or have we reached a stage where we need something more radical than is what Tom is suggesting?
Well, I think returning to classic liberalism, because classic liberalism has that problem of the violence of exclusion, because it was typically for white men, male property owners, and so I think that in a way, neoliberalism is definitely nobody can get outside of neoliberalism, so it leans over on the other side with this all-inclusive corrective measurement. So I would say we have to push on to the next thing, and I actually think that the work that's being done here at the University of Helsinki and TINT is part of the answer. And what I mean by that is that the way that game theory and rational choice theory is the hegemonic way of thinking about what needs to be a rational actor really around the world right now, and that programs and ways of thinking that have alternative ways for people to get together, to cooperate, to have commitment. I think the social ontology group that's here with Raimo Tumula and with my colleagues, Raul and Pekka, if they're still here. I think that it's very important to show that there are different ways for people to be together than just always to be rationally competitive. And so I think we need more philosophical, more theoretical work, just the way that the game theory came around and reimagined what it is to be an actor and help to form this neoliberal paradigm, that we need creative and imaginative micro-foundational thinking about how people can have relationships that are interdependent, that would be based on commitment, solidarity, and cooperation. So that would be my hope, from nothing from the top down, but from the bottom up.
Does anyone else want to answer?
Maybe just to take up that thing about whether in classical problems of classical liberalism. For example, it's often said that classical liberalism was based on colonial and racist attitudes. And I often feel that the critique of classical liberalism in that sense is sort of shallow, in the sense like when you show that, okay, John Stuart Mill had this wonderful thing about the harm principle and individual freedom. He was also a colonial racist, right? Let's assume he was a colonial racist. This argument has been made. So does this mean that liberal principles of freedom are inherently contaminated by colonial and racist attitudes? Or does it mean that one could think that John Stuart Mill was colonialist and racist because those were dominant ideas of his time, but still the principle of the harm principle and individual freedom principle could be used without the contamination of colonialism and racism? And I'm often surprised how easily the whole classical liberal, in the sense I use the term construction, is accused of colonialism and racism without really looking at whether they are inherently connected with liberal ideals of freedom.
Well put. I'd be happy to go back to classical liberalism. Personhood, property, contract. That's a good start. I would certainly.
You have to justify property there, because
I don't think you have to justify property. I mean, I would go now the dangerous territory, but it starts with personhood, with my ownership of my own body, the ownership of the work I do, my ability to exchange this work for a salary or
property.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's where it starts from. Happy to hear. That's where I start the emphasis on why liberalism and property rights are so important. It starts with the ownership of your own body and the fruits of your work. So that's a short way of saying that I wouldn't mind at all if we went back to classical liberalism.
But that is also where the provocative aspects of the sort of blind spots of liberalism become acute. Those blind spots that were mentioned by Teivo, that is who owns her, his, their body and workforce, and that then we really are in a dangerous ground. Are we equal? So the whole sort of notion of equality then comes in here. I think there is a lot of technological utopianism at the moment. Media technologies are not talked about positively. There's been a really radical change, especially since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. Since then, talk on media has become really imbued with war metaphors, an idea of media as site of warfare, and a securitization of the whole discourse has taken place, and that is also a context for what is now being debated in Finland very much. And yet, at the same time, when there is a desire to regain control of sort of social media or media technologies gone mad or turned against all hopes about radical democracy or democratic promise, there is there are lots of many different kinds of smaller and bigger inventions, innovations, projects happening. So I think this is also very promising, and I would insist in sort of holding on to the promise of communication, even though the world seems to be full of big talk. So I think it is important, if we also think about this, your Socratic dialogue point in the very beginning, that there has to be desire for real contact and dialogue. And if we give up that, sort of, which becomes so cynical that we give up that, then we are lost. But I think not everybody is securitized yet, which is good.
I want to add two things. One is, I think, one reason we're so fucked is that we have a very narrow conception of freedom. And I think we can learn something about freedom from classical liberalism. But I think even there's too little attention to the intrinsic connection between freedom and responsibility. That there's no freedom without responsibility. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, which I think really takes beyond the liberal tradition, is this meaning of life question. That to what extent is freedom, to what role does freedom play in a meaningful life? And there's a reductive understanding. I don't say that freedom is not important. It is important, but it's in one dimension, one aspect of meaning of life. And I think if these two things are taken seriously, then big things will happen. But these are deep civilizational changes that are needed. I think really it's very dangerous to think that there can be quick fixes to the finance, and climate, and migration, and chaos of chaos these are bringing, and also the reality of civilization. So I think our responses have to be much deeper, and we have to dig much deeper into ourselves as well, in how we understand the meaning of purpose of our own lives. I think that is the only way. I'm not saying this as, I'm not suggesting we give up politics, but I think the political search has to search for truth.
So we have actually quite a few questions. Well, maybe I would choose some controversial one that puts pressure on your central brain here. So why, I mean, maybe you mentioned this in your presentation, but here's a question about why is the rational choice necessarily egoistic in neoliberalism? Couldn't it be imagined that the utility of an individual is altruistic or compassionate in a game theoretic matrix? What is it about game theoretic that has to have the supposition of selfishness?
Yes, so the argument is often made that with game theory you can put everything in the expected utility function, including altruism and including what it would mean to have commitment or solidarity. But it turns out to be a very deep philosophical and theoretical question of how exactly you stuff everything into the utility function, so that some of the authors, including Francesco Gual, who was just here last week, concede in their own papers things like reciprocity, even reciprocity, let alone solidarity, let alone commitment. Even reciprocity cannot be put in an expected utility function. So there are limits, and the fact that there are these limits, and yet models are used to create institutions, means that they inherently end up creating institutions with this blindness for other ways that we could coordinate our actions, and including deontology is a big weakness, and the moral theories that Thomas spoke about. So that's my answer to that question.
Thanks. So maybe we were doing fake news ourselves when we were advertising this as a fake news event. We haven't talked very much about post-truth politics. So you mentioned that you didn't quite like the title. So if we could see, or how do you connect this theme of post-truth politics? So you talked about Donald Trump uttering falsehood. I mean, so how is that inherently connected to game theory or neoliberal, or is it at all? Maybe I'll give this to Risto first. If you think there's any connection, or is it just that there is none?
I don't see a connection. Donald Trump and liberalism, be it neoclassical or anything, do not belong together. I mean, there's nothing liberal about man. But if I sort of go into this sort of post-truth era that we are and try to look at it from a neoliberal perspective, then what we have here is a market failure. And when you have a market failure, it's normally caused by there not being enough reliable information so that people can make exchanges and in a rational manner. And I think that this is what we are seeing. There's not enough information about who is saying what, where does this come from. I don't have a solution. But I think that that would be the only way I can think of combining a neoliberal paradigm and post-truth politics.
Teivo, did you want to comment?
Well, I think this is where there is a strong disagreement, because in terms of this idea that the market will solve the post-truth era, that's where there would be this disagreement that on the one hand there's the Wendy Brown and the what Anna was talking about, and I think to me I agree with this, that neoliberalism leads to the post-truth politics moment, because the idea that there would be a market solution has this idea that if only we put enough of a price on truth, people will have the right incentive to speak the truth. But then there's this idea again that you can just incentivize all action, and then that reinforces the idea that communication is just a strategic game. And of course, then people will just utter the statements that will pay in the end. So here's where there's a dramatic divergence, where in classical liberalism, to tell the truth would just be one of those negative virtues that you would have because you harm people by lying. And you need a different kind of virtue ethics that includes epistemic virtue that comes from the classical liberal tradition, which is exactly what neoliberalism eliminates. So I would have a different solution.
Okay, I think that your take was surprising, because I gave you an indication that there might not be a market solution. Because if one says that there's a market failure, then that's a very common argument for a political or state intervention or something that I don't normally like, and I don't like in this event either. But this was my approach, not that there would be necessarily a market-based solution.
But then the solution is typically governance with sanctions. So you have some kind of a regime that comes in, it has to monitor and try to come up with a way of penalizing people for not telling the truth, rather than having a different basis of conduct that would actually look for an intrinsic meaning to truth-telling, or finding that it's fundamental to either human being, human freedom, or human relationships to be truthful in communication, that it's more fundamental than just having some kind of external governance solution.
I think Nancy Fraser wrote very wisely when pointing out that there's been an intimate connection between ideas that media is necessary for democracy, democracy is key legitimization for media, and nation state is the context, or the Westphalian territorial imaginary is the context where all of this is taught. And this sort of tradition has been there for the 20th century, but is increasingly challenged. And this is challenged by many things. But one, I think when talking about post-truth politics, we can't escape the fact that politics is communication, and has become more and more communication because of media technologies and the way the arenas where politics is being done. And this has created a new professional class, policy professionals and PR professionals, who sort of take care of that there is talk all the time, and that there is strategic communication. And this, of course, is something Sonia already alluded to earlier, but this strategic communication is neither truth nor lie, but is this grey area where politics is being done. And I think I think it's difficult to make an argument about, connection between game theory or neoliberalism, but I think that this historical development is crucial, and any discussion of post-truth politics cannot sort of escape this.
Thank you. I grabbed the mic here because I think I have a good question right on the topic. This is a question about rather than about how politics is affected by media and certain norms of communication. The other way around about media and the incentives for truth-telling. So the question is, if not strategic rationality, if not supporting this game theoretic notion of strategic rationality, what kind of rationality would enable us to be accountable, honest, and truthful? So I take that the premise of this question is that markets are kind of good ways of incentivizing truthfulness and not to deceive. And maybe this also perhaps links up to this question of what medias we should trust or which ones you do trust. So yeah, does anybody want to pick up on that?
I think here the idea, so on the one hand there's the idea of pure rationality. Can someone sit in an office and come up with a better theory of rationality? But on the other hand, there's just all kinds of institutions would foster this what Anna was talking about, media democracy, some kind of a public sphere that would vet claims about fact and about values, the Habermasian view. What kinds of institutions would actually generate a healthy public sphere? And I think, yes, the philosophical part would be important, but it would also be important to think out what kinds of institutions, and would those institutions be beyond incentives? Would there be something about epistemic virtue? Also in scientific research, because we're finding that the neoliberalization of the university is also entering into the way that research is conducted. So it's a pretty big question of how these institutions are formed to facilitate the kind of truth-seeking that we've been used to in the Enlightenment West.
About the institutions and truth-seeking, I think one of the big fake news here is the idea that capitalist corporate power somehow implies market. And they're making claims that if you think market is good for something, let's say more truthful something, then we need to do things that transfer power to capitalist corporations as if they represented market. And if we study real capitalism, not the sort of economics 101 ideas of market, we see that what's happened has been similar kind of fake news to some extent that happened to some people when they were looking at Soviet Union and they were thinking, hey, there's socialist ideals there. And people came and said, no, real socialism in real existing stuff happening in Soviet Union has very little to do with socialist ideals, but it's something else, authoritarian and so on and so forth. So I suggest we take a similar look at the fake news about capitalism as if it was a market economy. Because if you study, for example, world trade, I've been doing a little bit of that, and inter-firm trade and transfer pricing and all that, a very significant proportion of really existing capitalism is corporations selling to themselves and buying to themselves. Then the market idea, which is price and the truthfulness of price formation, which is supposed to be the true indicator of things in the market. How can institutions that sell to themselves and buy to them from themselves through transfer pricing and internal sort of inter-firm trade claim that there's some market kind of truthfulness to the information contained in the price? So if not even the price is truthful in a market sense in capitalist economy, then many other things are not truthful either, because the truthfulness of other things is based on this fundamental and often non-questioned idea that prices contain market-based information. So what do you think, Risto?
I think you're wrong. So you are, we're going into...
Oh, I thought finally I was convinced.
It's called bookkeeping. That's where you find out what the prices are that they use. If we try and say in the post-truth, or do you want to take another question? I can reply to this.
Okay. You want to
No, I'm happy to reply, but just in terms of time.
Maybe we should have one more question. And, so, if neoliberalism has brought emerging economies forwards towards it, are they also stronger in the fake news post-truth area? So, what do you envision for the future, I guess, is this question. Tommy.
I think there's the problem with the critique of neoliberalism. One is that it's been philosophical too shallow. Sonia helps us make it a bit less shallow. But the other problem is that we haven't attended enough to what Risto brings out, and I think it's very important for you to say that we are all also extremely impressed by what era which we call the neoliberal era. This idea has been that these 2,000 million people have been lifted from poverty to middle class consumerist lifestyle. It's a very powerful idea, and I think the most powerful argument, single argument for the success of whether we call it authoritarian capitalism or satanic globalization, neoliberalism. I prefer satanic globalization. I think it's the most exact term. I think give a good reason for that. But so let's call it satanic globalization, and then ask ourselves: is it a good thing? And there's one very powerful argument, and one argument that Risto brought out. So many Chinese and Indians are now living happy consumer lives. That's one very important argument. And it is winning. Modi won the elections in Gujarat last week. This fascist is plenty of blood on Modi's hands. Plenty. And this fascist won the elections again in Gujarat. So how can it win? One is consumer, the middle class. The other is child mortality or infant mortality. So these are big arguments. And I think there's a common mistake among people close to me. We think, oh, but it's we're at the this is the last moment triumph before we we run into the abyss, we fall over the cliff edge, and then climate catastrophe comes. There's no such thing as proving that it's going in the wrong direction. So I think the only I mean, because you can always say we need more growth in order to be able to combat climate change. So there's no degrowth can never win the debate, and other leftist romanticists can never win the debate with neoliberals like Risto. So it's only by addressing. I repeat myself, but it's only by localizing. It's only by seeing that markets bring difference, which are the subjects of moral relations and others. It's only by radically delocalizing, radically cutting off from satanic globalization that we live dignified lives.
I'm going to give the last word to Sonia.
Well, I think that is a really interesting question about the emerging neoliberal economies. And I think, well, China, I don't know exactly, are they authoritarian capitalists? That's probably the best way to speak of them. And is that what we would endorse as descendants in the West of a Western liberal paradigm that's transformed somehow from neoliberalism into neoliberalism? Would we endorse the Chinese authoritarian model? Would we endorse the Singaporean model? And I tend to agree with Thomas that I don't find those emancipatory, even if somehow the quality of life in terms of material goods has improved. But I wonder about whether the world that we're moving into, whether this kind of capitalism is ultimately sustainable. And I think that neoliberalism and sustainability, if I'm looking at how the neoliberal emerging economies are developing, I would ask about authoritarian capitalism. I think we're seeing that is the trend. And then, well, are they sustainable? Those are the questions that I would ask, but it's a great question.
Well, we have plenty more questions here, and we could probably continue for a very long time on this, but we can continue a bit over wine. So I want to thank the audience for listening and for all your questions, and sorry we couldn't answer all of them. And thank you. So we were clear from the beginning that it's a very sad event today because also Sonia is leaving Helsinki University. She will come back and visit, but it will be a sadder and poorer place without you. Sorry.